Hi there everyone, and welcome to another week of the Good News According to Job. I hope that the last couple of weeks have been helpful. It's gotten you to really wrestle with Job a little bit more in ways that you possibly haven't before. And yeah, I really hope that as we go ahead, that it will continue to stimulate your thinking and get you to wrestle with, well, in one sense, a book of wisdom. And Job is packed with it, and in the way that it's constructed, there is so much wisdom to be found. Just to let you know what is going to be happening over the next couple of weeks, we've decided to at this point actually split the course or the Bible study, and there are two options that you can go with. The first option that you can go with is a shortened version. And in that we will, over the next 3 weeks, basically be looking at this week Job's friends, the next week we'll look at God, and then we'll conclude with Job and how that concludes. So that will be the next 3 weeks with a shortened course of working through Job. If, however, you want to really get into the nitty-gritty and see the bigger questions and things that are getting asked, then there's the other course which will take a little bit longer as we go through each thing that gets discussed, each person that speaks, looking at Job's friends and each thing that they have to say, followed by the responses and also God's response, and then getting to the conclusion. So it depends on how deep you want to go. And we're making this available because we know that perhaps you don't want to go through everything, and that's okay. But if you feel that you would like to, that you would feel it's beneficial and it would help, then go through the whole thing. This will then obviously take us out of when we're done with lockdown and into the rest of the year. If you're going to go with the long course, or if the short one, then hopefully by the time lockdown is over, then we'll be done with Job. So depending on how you want to approach it, I encourage you to really try and do both. Maybe get a bit of an overview from the shorter course, as well as look into the nitty-gritty of it. There's so much there that unfortunately we can't capture that all in 3 weeks. But if you want the broader unpacking and course that we'll do and Bible study on Job, that will really get into a little bit more of the details that will be missed if we go too fast. So it's really up to you. If you want to, there's the short one. If you want to really dig in, there will be the longer Bible study available. And we'll be posting both of those. You make the decision. And yeah, hopefully they will both benefit you, and you'll be encouraged and challenged and grow from it. I know just working through Job has challenged me and has grown me and has really got me thinking in different ways. And from my personal side, I would really say if you have the time, get into all of it as much as you can. And I would be excited if there are some of you that would like to take the journey with me. I know I'm excited to go through it, so hopefully you'll be on board and would be keen to join. Great, but as for that, that is a way of introduction to both of these courses, and so from here we will then look at either the shortened one or the lengthened one, but this is just a way of introduction for both of those. So just hang in there for a second, and we will get started with the short or the long course, depending on which one you choose. We'll see now. Cheers. Hi there and welcome back. And so you've chosen the short version of Job, which implies that we're going to look at Job over the next 3 weeks. We'll start by looking at Job and his friends and really contemplating just how it's constructed and put together and what they have to say and how it's significant to us and what makes it so interesting and helpful and challenging, and how it stirs us to think about things slightly differently. The following 2 weeks we'll look at then God and his response and what he has to say to Job, and then finally we'll conclude by looking at Job and really summarizing the book as a whole, just so that we have a good hold on what the book of Job is about. But if this isn't for you, if you feel you want to get into more detail, at any time feel free to switch over to the other videos. Those will be aired hopefully within a day or two of these ones. So they hopefully will be aired together, if I can do my best to get that right. But they will be available, and you can take a look at whichever one you want, or look at this one, and then when you're done with this, go do the other one, and yeah, really wrestle with Job and get into the nitty-gritty of Job. As for this week, I'm going to kick us off just with a quote, or actually just reading out of another book of wisdom in the Old Testament. And that book that we are going to be looking at is just Proverbs 3. And a very familiar verse for most of you. This verse, or these verses, are very familiar to us. We've quoted them, we've heard them quoted a lot. And hopefully, as we look at it, it will change maybe your perspective slightly on these verses, as well as how you approach and look at Job, and particularly his friends and what they have to say. So, the verses that we are going to look at is Proverbs 3, verses 5 to 8. It says this: "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. This will bring health to your body and nourishment to your bones." And so, just as a way of introduction, this passage is really about wisdom. It's about asking the question of what is wisdom, what is true wisdom, and that ultimately wisdom comes down to where are you focused? Where are you looking? Are you trusting in your own understanding? Because that's a dangerous thing to do, and it could be very destructive as well, and it could lead you down the wrong path. Or are you trusting in God? Are you, as it says in verse 6, "In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil." And that "fear the Lord and shun evil" is so similar to those phrases that we hear about Job, and he was regarded as a man that was upright and blameless, and he feared the Lord and he shunned evil. And so, just as a way of introduction, thinking about these few verses and how they affect the way we look at Job's friends. And so just before we look into the more detailed aspects of his friends, we need to once again just consider who they are. So we have, the first one is Eliphaz, Bildad, and then Zophar. Those are the first three friends that we hear from, and then it's only later that we hear from Elihu. But just to give you a little bit of background that there is, that we can gather from who they are and their names, they are ascribed, the three friends are ascribed to tribes that are outside of Israel as a nation. And so they are not part of Israel's nation. They are nations of their own, or they are of other nations. And most likely that they were ascribed to nations or tribes of wisdom. So you have, as we look at it, we see that there is very little that connects them to Israel's history, or in that line, that they do things differently, that they think about things differently. And so you have Eliphaz, who his name could suggest something in Hebrew that could mean something along the lines of God is fine gold, something along that line. But beyond that, there is no further understanding of who he is, and he's not, in the sense that he's not of Israel, but he is most likely of a tribe, a nation that is ascribed to be of wisdom, having wisdom. Zophar and Bildad, again, they have no Hebrew name, but it is significant, however, if we turn to the fourth friend, Elihu. He comes along and he does have a Hebrew name, and his name actually means he is my God. Elihu is the Hebrew for meaning he is my God. And so when Elihu comes onto the scene, perhaps our expectation of what he is going to say is shaped in one sense by his name. And so we'll look at that in a little bit. As for the first three friends, what we can learn from them and the way in which they communicate is they are talking to Job, they are observing Job and observing Job within his suffering. So this is important for us to keep in mind, that their responses are in light of Job's suffering. They see Job, who is incredibly in pain and hardship and struggling and suffering, and so they respond to him. They respond to what he is saying. If you remember last week, the way Job cried out, and he was in absolute pain and anguish, and so what happens is you have this responses flowing from Job's pain and anguish and all the things that he is going through. But each friend responds slightly differently, and what I mean by that is they use different forms of, put it in this way, wisdom in the way in which they respond. And it's quite interesting, because when you start to contemplate how each one responds, it really doesn't give us much room to escape. What I mean by that is that so many of their responses will resonate with some of us in the various areas, in the way we think and the way we communicate and share things. So if you are scientifically minded, perhaps a good person, and to see how he has responded, is Eliphaz. Eliphaz responds very scientifically, observation-wise. He observes things and he shares it from that perspective. And then the other person that you have is Bildad, who expresses wisdom from a place of more experience-based, which is quite significant. So he observes things, but not only experiential, but pictorial. So he speaks out of this very creative kind of way of communicating. He paints a picture from experience, and seeing things and painting that picture, which is very similar to Eliphaz. Not a massive detachment, but just the way in which he communicates is also slightly different. And then you have Zophar, which is quite unique. He speaks from a place of establishing wisdom, but in a very philosophical way. So you have Zophar, that's in one sense the philosopher of the group, and he's the last one to speak of the three friends. So when we come to the three friends, maybe a good question to ask ourselves as we read through these friends, and before we get too lost in everything that they have to say, because they have some phenomenal things to say. They have some very important things in one sense to say as they speak to Job. But the question is, are they speaking from their own understanding, or are they speaking in light of who God is? So the question is, going back to Proverbs 3, are they trusting in the Lord with all their heart as they're observing Job and seeing his suffering? And furthermore, or are they leaning on their own understanding to help them, to inform them of the situation that they're speaking into? So that's interesting. Are they trusting in God fully, or are they leaning on their own understanding as they wrestle with this hardship that Job is facing? So that's an important thing to maybe keep in the back of your mind. Wrestle through it, contemplate it. Just try and see if maybe those things come to the surface as you read, hopefully as well. But just as a way of contemplating these characters a little bit further, we'll quickly take a look at Eliphaz, and I just want to show you and highlight for you something that he does say in Job 4, verse 8. It says here, "As I have observed, those who plow evil and those who sow trouble reap it." And so, very plainly put, he says, I've observed, and that if someone sows, if they do something that is evil, they will reap it. And that is what they will get. If those who sow trouble reap it. Very plainly. So that is this observable, it's reason-based wisdom, in one sense, that Eliphaz demonstrates for us. He looks at things, he reasons them out, he contemplates them in light of his worldview, how he understands things, how he perceives the world, and how God responds in light of actions. And so very plainly he has said to Job right up front that what has happened to you is obviously comes down to the fact that you must have done something. Something in your life you have done, and so you're reaping it. You have sowed evil somewhere, and so you reap it. And so this is very reason-based. He sees Job suffering. That suffering must come from somewhere, and the only conclusion is that somewhere Job has done something that offends, undermines, is wicked or evil toward God. So that seems quite straightforward. That's the person of Eliphaz. And so as he continues to talk, you see more and more of this kind of thing coming out. And he speaks very reason-based. And it's not in one sense wrong. In many ways it seems to be true. Even Proverbs 3 seems to highlight the fact that that is true. So let's see that second part of what we read then in Proverbs, where he says in verse 8, "This will bring health to your body and nourishment to your bones." See, the writer in Proverbs actually seems to suggest the same thing that Eliphaz is saying here, that if you do what is right, if you fear God, if you shun evil, things will go well with you. Your bones will be in a good state. You will be healthy. And so it's interesting that he kind of picks up on the same idea, but perhaps there is something that is missing. So again, we need to state something because we so quickly forget about it. In light of what Eliphaz has said, that Job has done something that is wrong, he has done evil, we mustn't forget what God has told us about Job. Job is blameless, he is upright, he fears God and he shuns evil. And this is what we are told about Job. So how is it that what Eliphaz is then saying is true? Can it be true? Now the reality is that what Eliphaz is saying within his worldview, within what truth he is speaking, is most likely true, but not for Job. For Job we have a unique circumstance because God has informed us that Job is blameless, that he is upright, he fears God and he shuns evil. And we mustn't lose sight of that. So it's not to say that the friends are outright wrong in every word that they say, but for the most part they are very right in what they are saying. But what they are saying is just not applicable for Job and his circumstance. Job, a man that is blameless, upright, fears God and shuns evil. A man that exemplifies, in one sense, wisdom. A man that exemplifies what it means to trust in the Lord your God with all your heart and not to lean on your own understanding. And we see that as these discussions, as these discourses take place with Job and his friends, how Job further develops in that he's less and less leaning on his own understanding, if he ever was, but he becomes more and more dependent on who God is, and for God to give him the answer for all that has happened to him. So hopefully that's helpful to get a grasp around Eliphaz and how he plays an important role from a reason-based perspective, and he wrestles and challenges Job on a reason-based wisdom, and while Job is really contemplating things on a slightly different level. So Eliphaz, as well as the other three friends, you will notice they will look in one sense upward. It seems as though they are looking to God in light of Job. But to kind of paint it slightly different, they are using God to reflect on Job. So they are looking upward, or supposedly looking upward in the words that they say when they talk about God, but they're using God as a means to talk to Job. They are using God as a way in which they can challenge Job. They are using God in a way in which they can, in one sense, you'll pick up the language that they use. So for example, Eliphaz as well as Bildad and Zophar, they all highlight this kind of idea that who can know the mind of God? Who can fathom it? Who are you to know God? And the challenge is that in saying that, they then will go on to say, but if you repent, or if you turn to God, if you fall to Him and you trust in Him, He will prosper you. He will look after you. He will pick you up. He will provide for you again. And so who are you then to know that God will do that? If you fall to your knees, how can you be so certain that God will do what you think He's going to do? And so you have this weird tension taking place the whole time as they make their comments. look closely to see, is that fully true in light of Job's circumstance? Is it fully true for a man that is blameless, upright, who shuns evil and fears God? The next person that we need to highlight quickly is Bildad. And so Bildad he's a interesting character as well. He's slightly different to Eliphaz in the way he communicates. Bildad is far more pictorial, so he paints a lot more pictures in the way he communicates and he shares things. But his pictures are based in experience. His pictures are based in very, almost everyday kind of experiences. As he looks around him, he sees creation, he sees life, and so he speaks in those pictures, these paintings that he creates for us to understand who God is and who Job is in light of that. And again, Bildad does the same here, in the sense that he uses God to communicate to Job. So it kind of creates this idea that perhaps these three friends are turning to God and then looking to Job, rather than actually seeing it for what it is. They are talking to Job. They are just using God as a means to convey their point, which is quite a dangerous thing to do, to use God as the kind of driving force behind your argument, or the endorser behind your argument, rather than to say, God, why don't you argue for yourself? So that's an interesting thing to wrestle through. Here you have these three friends. They are trying to have an endorsed argument, endorsed by God's name, not necessarily by God himself, where Job develops as a person in his wrestling, and eventually he is turning to God and saying, God, you talk to me, you challenge me, you speak to me, you show me who I am and who you are, so that I can understand. And so it's interesting. It's quite different then in how they convey their arguments between Job's friends and Job himself. And so Bildad being the one that conveys these pictures and how he argues from that, as well as using experience. So he's in one sense an experiential wisdom. He speaks from what he has experienced in life. The next person that we look at is, just briefly, Zophar. Zophar is quite an interesting one. If we turn there to the first time Zophar speaks in Job 11, we read this, which is quite significant for us. He says this in verse 4, "You say to God, my beliefs are flawless, and I am pure in your sight. Oh, how I wish that God would speak, that he would open his lips against you, and disclose to you the secrets of wisdom. For true wisdom has two sides. Know this, God has even forgotten some of your sin." And so this is quite interesting. And the reason for this is on a couple of levels. The first is that up until this point, this is a book of wisdom, but this is the first place that wisdom as a word gets really used to convey a point. And so Zophar becomes in one sense, the one that introduces wisdom into the book of Job. There's one other mention of wisdom before this, but it is used to convey it in a picture more than in a way of arguing. And so Zophar introduces wisdom here in chapter 11 for the first time. And from here on, there becomes a far greater discussion about wisdom, used by the other two friends, used by Elihu, used by God. That wisdom then becomes introduced as an idea, far more stronger than before. And so the reason why I'm highlighting this is because Zophar then comes across as quite a peculiar character. Not that they had what we understand as philosophy. They had different views back then, or a different approach to philosophy. But Zophar becomes, in one sense, a type of philosopher. Zophar becomes sort of he shows philosophical wisdom, for lack of a better way of putting it. And what I mean by that is he contemplates things slightly more deeply, and how he looks at how to wrestle with life and who God is, and the deeper workings of what wisdom is. And so you kind of pick that up in verse 6 of chapter 11, when he says that true wisdom has two sides. And then he kind of, his next statement is quite ironic then, because he says, know this, God has even forgotten some of your sin. Now this is an interesting thing, and it shows the irony, but it also shows the two-sidedness to wisdom. That statement may be very true, that wisdom has two sides. But then in saying, know this, that God has forgotten some of your sins, it is maybe a wise statement in what he is saying, but it's two-sided. In what is implied is that perhaps what Zophar is saying at this point to Job is that, Job, you have sinned so much that God can't keep track of your sin anymore. Or, on the other side, it could actually be insinuating that God forgets about people's sin. So what is he saying? And now obviously Zophar is not intending to say that God forgets, that God is a forgetful God, but more so that Job has sinned so much that God has forgotten some of his sin. So it's a bit of a play on words, but there is irony in it. There is irony in the fact that Zophar will say that wisdom has two sides, and then suddenly the next thing he says shows almost that two-sidedness to wisdom. And so Zophar is philosophical in that way. And so as he kind of explains things and as he wrestles through things, we kind of get this idea from Zophar as he really weighs up almost more the meaning of things, and not that he doesn't look at things and observe things and look at experience, but his weight is put slightly differently. So those are the three friends. Kind of very brief overview of what you could expect from the way they're going to communicate to Job. And so they communicate many things to Job. They say a lot to Job and challenge Job and get agitated with Job. And just to highlight how it ends off, we find in chapter 25, that Bildad eventually ends off in this. He says in verse 5, if even the moon is not bright and the stars are not pure in his eyes, how much less a mortal, who is but a maggot, a human being who is only a worm. And the reason why I'm highlighting this is because if we remember last week, Job was in the pit. Job was devastated. He was shaken. He was sharing his heart and how he wanted to go to the grave. And then we have this progression of Job through these following chapters, at least up to chapter 25 here, where Bildad speaks. And Job starts to take a different curve. He starts to curve upward. And the reason why I say he curves upward, he starts to shift from the state that he's in, and he starts to curve upward, reflecting more and more on who God is. Along the way, he falls back, and he goes through those doldrums of struggling and hardship and reflecting on life and it not being the way he expected it to be or hoped it to be. And so Job oscillates, but he progresses upward, reflecting and turning and looking to God in that way. Whereas while his friends come to him on a platform, in one sense, on a pedestal of some sorts, with their wisdom, with their knowledge, with everything they have, and to get to where Bildad ends off and being the last one to speak, he kind of ends off in the pit, saying, well, as he highlights there, how much less a mortal, who is but a maggot, a human being who is only a worm. And in light of what he's saying there, he's actually highlighting, reflecting on Job, and he's saying, well, if this is the case, then you're a maggot, you're a worm. And really, he's almost gotten to the place of speaking about Job where Job was in the beginning. And this is frightening, because this seems to be the trajectory of things. While the friends get more and more downhearted and frustrated, Job seems to become more encouraged. And there are these glimpses, these little moments where he seems to have hope. Just to give one example, where Job does say something that is actually quite phenomenal. He says this, and this is in Job 19, verse 24. Actually starting at 23. Oh, that the words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on lead, or engraved in rock forever. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. So this seems an 180-degree turnaround from where Job was in the beginning. And so he's not yet fully there, but he is going through the motions, and he is he's getting to a point where he's turning and reflecting on God more and more and trusting in God more and more, while the friends seem to be getting disheartened because their arguments are getting them nowhere. Their arguments are taking them in circles. And so what's interesting is that the third time round, Zophar doesn't even say anything. Zophar, the one who seemed philosophical, who seemed to show wisdom, perhaps suggests that he has become wise in not speaking the third time round. But that's speculation. But it is interesting to notice that they get to a point where they are incapable of saying anything. And if that's not enough, we hear then from Elihu. So just turning there, in Job 32, it gives us an introduction. It said, so these three men stopped answering Job, because he was righteous in his own eyes. But Elihu, son of Barachel, the Buzite of the family of Ram, became very angry with Job for justifying himself rather than God. He was also angry with the three friends, because they had found no way to refute Job, and yet had condemned him. Now Elihu had waited before speaking to Job, because they were older than he. But when he saw that the three men had nothing more to say, his anger was aroused. And so Elihu comes onto the scene, this man who, what we know his name to represent is, he is my God, and he has come onto the scene. He's frustrated with these men that represent the nations outside of Israel, and now this man with the Israelites name, with a Hebrew name, comes onto the scene, and he is about to speak. He is the youngest of the lot, as it says there, which could suggest not only that he is of age younger, but as a nation, as a representative of Israel, the wisdom that they share in relation to the wisdom of the world is far less, in one sense almost advanced, but far deeper in a different way. And so in that time, obviously in the ancient Near East, there were so many different world views and nations and tribes around Israel, and all of them had so many progressive and developed worldviews and philosophies and thoughts and wisdoms. But here you get to Elihu, who proclaims to be the youngest. He seems to come across in humility, but in the same breath he comes in anger, which shows a hot-headedness in one degree toward not only Job but the friends, because they have not been able to convince Job of his error. The unfortunate thing is, as we work through Elihu's argument, is he does come to the same conclusion ultimately as the three friends. He doesn't have a far as greater or more advanced argument, but the way in which he does argue is far deeper, in that he is not arguing out of wisdom from the world, but out of a reflection on who God is. So what makes Elihu significant is he is contemplating most of the time who God is, and how that affects who Job is. So most of Elihu's argument, as just to flesh that out a little bit more, he will look to creation, he will look at who God is and what God has created and who he is, and how magnificent God is, to build his argument, which is advanced from the three friends before. They were using God as the endorser of what they had to say, whereas Elihu looks to God to build his argument, which is significant because that is quite different in one sense to how the friends argue. But as we start with Elihu, the expectations are high. There's this expectation that Elihu's going to get it right. He's going to grasp something, and he's going to be able to communicate a truth that needs to be said, and to really get Job back on track. And maybe if you are reading through Job and you got to Elihu's argument, you had forgotten that what the author and what God has said about Job is that he is blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. But you think that perhaps at this point Job has done something wrong. He has said something that's wrong. But here, as Elihu's argument goes, you're almost convinced that he is going to highlight something new for us, something that we had missed, somehow that Job had missed something or done something wrong. And yet he gets to the same conclusion, that ultimately Job must have done something wrong, and that he must repent. He must turn back to God. But this is a pity, because what we know is that Job was blameless, upright, feared God, and shunned evil. And so this interplay continually takes place, but the whole time Job developing in his thoughts, growing in his reflection, and ultimately calling out to God. And then many times Job calls in a way that is almost so provoking and so strong in his words. At one point he essentially calls God to court. He says, God, I'm signing this thing. Let me read for us. He says, "Oh, that I had someone to hear me. I sign now my defense. Let the Almighty answer me." I mean, this is such an image of a courtroom. And so Job is calling God, in one sense, to come and to stand and give his account. And Job has now signed his defense. He is now waiting for God to speak. Which is crazy, to think that he would use that language, and now he's waiting for God to give him a reason, give him an argument, show him who God is, so that he will accept it and be content and move on. And so you have these different interplays taking place. And so after Job has said this, along comes Elihu to highlight, in one sense, who God is. But yet he comes to the same conclusion as the rest of the world, for that matter. And so as we contemplate that, this is just as I say, there's so much more. I can't get into the details at all of all that is in each of these discussions. But I encourage you to take time to read through Job. Read through all the different discourses, all the different things that get said, and really contemplate them. Ask the questions, in one sense, that we highlighted in Proverbs. Is the friends trusting in the Lord with all their heart? Or are they leaning on their own understanding? And then the next question that maybe you can ask is that next part in verse 7 of Proverbs 3. Do not be wise in your own eyes, fear the Lord and shun evil. Who in Job is then doing that? Are they wise in their own eyes, or are they fearing God and shunning evil? And so, just to conclude, and to bring this back to us for a moment, is to really ask what do we do with this? What do we do with this information? How do we work with this? And the incredible thing is that the way Job's friends speak, they relate to most of us on different levels. So for some of us, we might what Eliphaz says might resonate with you differently to what maybe Bildad does, because they speak in different ways, and it's going to stir up different things for you in different ways. So what the friends say kind of are going to agitate us a little bit, and the different arguments by the different friends are going to agitate and stir up different things in us. And so whether you are scientific or observing things the whole time, or whatever the case may be, or maybe you're pictorial, maybe you're a creative-minded person, Bildad might speak better to you. Or maybe if you are scientific, that Eliphaz speaks more strongly to you, and he agitates you a little bit, or it stands out to you. But never to forget that as you're wrestling through Job, that Job was blameless and upright, that he feared God and he shunned evil. And so who is Job, and how does Job then respond to God? And so ultimately, at the end of the day, the argument that gets played around with in one sense is, well, what is wisdom then in light of these four friends and Job? Who is showing wisdom? And so you look at, is observable wisdom the right thing? Well, we kind of understand that that's not the ultimate thing. Is experiential or pictorial in one sense wisdom the thing? Is that the way in which we can understand things, by observing the world around us, those kind of things, and what we know, our experience, what's been handed down to us, tradition? Is that wisdom? Or is philosophy, contemplating more the depths of life, being philosophical in your thinking, is that wisdom? But what's interesting is even Elihu, in the way he speaks, suggests that that could be wisdom. He's looking to God, but his conclusions are still based in a very rigid framework, that you must have done something to get what you've gotten. You must have done evil in order that you have reaped this evil. But the interesting thing is that we overlook another wisdom. There's someone else's wisdom that we forget. And I'm using that loosely. But we forget to look at Job's wisdom. Job reflects and demonstrates an incredible amount of wisdom through his suffering, through the hardship that he faces. And Job grasps what that means. He understands what it means to serve people and help people that are in a place of suffering. He's done it before, but him going through the suffering reflects a level of wisdom. Not so much in that he has wise things to say, even though what he says may be true, but the wisdom that he demonstrates is the wisdom of turning to God, trusting in God, and not leaning on his own understanding. And so Job as a character develops and moves further and further away from leaning on his own understanding and depending on more and more on God to show him and demonstrate that understanding. So ultimately, Job not only reflects wisdom, but he reflects where wisdom comes from. That true wisdom comes from God. That there is no man that can have wisdom that is perfect. Wisdom will only be something that will be developed through experience or observation if it is from the world. But true wisdom, genuine wisdom, comes from God. Because God is all-knowing. God is the one that has created all things. And so when we look at what God has to say, we will get a better glimpse in the next week as we take a look at what wisdom really looks like. And so I encourage you for next week to go and read how God responds after Elihu, but to Job, what God has to say. So I hope this helps to challenge you to think it through. There is a lot, as I say, happening in these sections of Job. But read through it. Take the time to read through Job. If you have some questions that you would like to have answered, or you're not yet entirely sure, either watch the other videos that are going to be uploaded over the next couple of weeks, or just get in contact with us, and we can have a discussion. But hopefully this is, as I say, it's a bit of an overview in one sense, and there's so much more that could be said. But hopefully it really gets you to wrestle through, in one sense, where does wisdom come from? That wisdom is not of us. That true wisdom is from God, and that ultimately we are dependent to look to Him. And that at the end of the day, that wisdom that comes from God can shake us, can really shake our very thinking, our theology. It can turn our world upside down, because as we see with Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar and even Elihu, they share in one sense their theology, and even their theology seems to be shaken and challenged as Job wrestles through looking to who God is, and God reveals His wisdom. That God's wisdom surpasses our theology. So that's something worth thinking about and wrestling on. So do you think that what you know about God is bigger than who God is Himself? Because that is a dangerous territory in which we enter into, and we need to be careful that we don't think we are wise in our own eyes, as Proverbs says. So hopefully that challenges us and gets us, in one sense, humbles us, but also stirs us to really contemplate who God is, that we can really contemplate that in one sense, over and above our circumstances, over and above our suffering. That it's not so much who God is in our suffering, but that God is above our suffering, that God is greater than all things. So I hope this was encouraging, hope it was helpful, and hope you will join us next week. Have a good week. We'll see you. Cheers. Bye.